The chipped formica of the counter still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, even after hours old cleaner, the kind that leaves a film. I noticed it first when I leaned over to wipe down a spot someone had missed, before I even clocked in. It wasn't a pleasant smell, not exactly. More insistent. Like a memory someone was trying too hard to hold on to. Above the counter, someone had taped a handwritten sign, a little crooked, new special, tuna melt Mondays, with a question mark scrawled after it. Tuna melt Mondays at 2 in the morning. That summed it up. Denny's wasn't what I pictured when I finished my electrician's apprenticeship. Dad always said, "Get a trade, Gavin, something they can't automate." He didn't factor in a housing market that doubled in 5 years and a mountain of medical bills, $80,000. It felt like a second mortgage on the house, only it wasn't a loan, it was just gone. And the house, well, it was just a house, a drafty 2-story colonial in a town that was slowly shrinking. This job, though, it paid $13 an hour, and they were offering 40 hours. Enough to at least start chipping away at the debt. The place was mostly empty when I arrived. A couple of truckers nursing coffees, a woman in a faded floral dress staring out the window. Rand, the guy I was replacing, was already gone. Just a note taped to the time clock. Key in the office, good luck. No handshake, no explanation of the overnight routine. Just a key and good luck. The kitchen was stainless steel and grease, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and something vaguely sweet, like burnt sugar. The floor tiles were a patchwork of replacements, some newer, some cracked and stained. The walk-in cooler hummed like a refrigerator on its last legs. It wasn't exactly a culinary paradise, but it was a paycheck. Connie, the manager, handed me a thick binder labeled Denny's Employee Handbook and Procedures. It felt heavy, ancient. The cover was laminated and peeling at the edges. She didn't say much, just pointed to a section on food safety and told me to read it. "And there's some additional information tucked inside," she said, her voice flat. "Previous cook put it there. Don't ask me about it." She turned and walked back to her office, leaving me standing there with the binder and a growing sense of unease. I flipped through the handbook, mostly standard stuff. Proper hand-washing techniques, food temperature guidelines, how to deal with difficult customers. Then, halfway through, wedged between the section on breakfast specials and the employee discount policy, I found it. A separate sheet of paper, folded twice, typed in a plain, unremarkable font. It had a list, numbered 1 through 9. 1. If a visitor or resident tells you something about the building, its history, what happened here, what to watch out for, listen without confirming. Do not add to the account. 2. Do not use the service entrance alone. If no one is available to accompany you, use the main entrance regardless of inconvenience. 3. If asked your name while on the premises, give only your first name. Do not give your surname, your employee number, or any identifier that extends beyond the site. 4. If a room feels noticeably colder than the adjacent rooms, not drafty, just cold, do not enter alone. Return with another person or leave it for the next shift. 5. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch. 6. Do not say goodbye, see you later, or any farewell when leaving the premises. The departure phrase is shift change. Use only that. 7. Any incident report filed more than 2 years ago is sealed. Do not request, reference, or search for it. 8. Do not bring any items that are yellow onto the premises. This includes clothing, accessories, food packaging, or personal items. 9. If furniture or equipment has been moved overnight from its established position, log it but do not move it back. Work around it. I read it through twice, then a third time. It was odd. A little creepy, maybe. Probably just some elaborate prank a former employee had cooked up. Or maybe some weird tradition. A test, maybe? See who actually reads the handbook. It was definitely a place to make people feel a little off balance. I chuckled thinking about someone going to all this trouble. A little over the top, but harmless. I glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. Time to get to work. I started stocking the cooler, organizing the fry station, prepping the pancake batter. I made a mental note to check the back door, just to see where the service entrance was. Probably nothing. Just an old, unused door. I didn't have anything yellow on me. Thankfully, my jacket was navy, my shoes were brown. I briefly considered the implications of rule number 1. Who were these residents? Was this place haunted? I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was a Denny's, not a haunted mansion. I needed sleep, not ghost stories. As I finished stocking the cooler, I noticed something. A single, yellow napkin tucked under the bottom shelf. It wasn't there before. I remembered specifically clearing the shelf when I arrived. It was folded neatly, almost deliberately, and it felt wrong. Like a small, insistent prickle on the back of my neck. I pulled it out, crumpled it in my hand, and tossed it in the trash. Probably just someone being careless. Still. I checked the walk-in's only light switch twice as I left. I was wiping down the syrup dispensers, the sticky residue clinging to the cloth like a second skin. It was 2 a.m., and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerators and the occasional crackle of the radio. I'd switched to an oldies station, mostly because it was less talk, less presence. The truckers had both left around midnight, and the woman in the floral dress had finally wandered out, leaving a half-eaten plate of fries and a tip that barely covered the cost of the ketchup. The syrup bottles were particularly bad. Someone had really gone to town with the strawberry flavoring. It felt like it was glued on. I was using a fresh cloth for each one, trying not to smear the pink goo around. Focusing on the physical act of cleaning helped. It kept my mind from wandering to the mortgage, to Dad's bills, to the sheer monotony of the next 8 hours. I'd been thinking about calling Val, seeing if she was still awake, just to hear a voice. But it was late, and she had a full day tomorrow. Teaching 3rd grade wasn't exactly a relaxing job. I finished with the syrup and moved on to the sugar caddies, polishing the plastic until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting in a booth near the windows, the same one the woman in the floral dress had occupied. He hadn't been there a minute ago. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and a weathered face. He was wearing a brown tweed jacket and a slightly crooked tie. He looked out of place, not threatening, just wrong, like a character who'd wandered in from a different story. I glanced at the door, expecting to see Connie letting him in, but she wasn't there. She hadn't come out of her office since she'd given me the handbook. I figured he was a late arrival, maybe someone stopping for a quick bite on their way somewhere. I started to walk towards him, intending to ask if he needed anything, to offer him a coffee. He leaned forward as I approached, his eyes surprisingly bright and blue, fixed on mine. "This place," he began, his voice raspy but clear, "used to be a boarding house, back in the 50s. Old man Tiber built it. He ran it for years, a strict but fair man. They say he lost his daughter, little Gloria, to polio right here, in the upstairs rooms. Some folks claim you can still hear her crying on quiet nights." He continued detailing the layout of the rooms, the names of some of the long-term residents, even the color of the wallpaper in the parlor. He spoke with a strange conviction, as if he'd lived it, as if the boarding house hadn't been converted into a Denny's decades ago. He described a fire in the kitchen in 1968, a faulty gas line, and how Tiber had saved a young waitress named Nell. He mentioned a hidden room behind the pantry, used for, well, he trailed off there, just saying it wasn't a place for polite conversation. My hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. I hadn't nodded, hadn't offered any sort of affirmation, hadn't even made eye contact for more than a second. It was like I was watching a play, and he was the only actor on stage. I remembered something about the handbook, that rule, the one about listening without confirming, something about residence. It wasn't a clear memory, more of a vague impression, a sense of warning. Then, a fly buzzed past my ear, a loud, insistent drone that broke the spell. It landed on the sugar dispenser, right in front of my face. It was a big one, almost iridescent in the fluorescent light. An irrational annoyance flared in my chest. I swatted at it, missing, and it buzzed off toward the kitchen. The movement, the small, physical act of swatting, seemed to snap something into place. I stopped in front of the booth, keeping my face neutral. "That's interesting," I said, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the details he'd shared. "Can I get you something to drink?" He blinked, as if surprised by my interruption. He didn't seem disappointed, just reset. "Just a water, please." I turned and walked toward the beverage station, my back to him, my pace deliberately slow. I filled a glass with water, adding a lemon wedge for good measure, and carried it back to his booth. He thanked me, his blue eyes still fixed on my face. I set the glass down and quickly retreated back to the kitchen. The fly was still buzzing around the sugar dispenser. I killed it with a rolled-up newspaper, a sudden, brutal act. It felt necessary. I needed to break the stillness to assert some kind of control. I tossed the crumpled newspaper in the trash, next to the yellow napkin. I made a note to check the cameras. Maybe Connie had seen someone enter. Maybe I was just tired. But I knew with a chilling certainty that it wasn't just tiredness. Something was different. The air felt heavier, the hum of the refrigerators louder. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning. I was restocking the napkin dispensers. It was just something to do, something to occupy the dead space between the graveyard shift's lulls. Each table held a little pyramid of white folded paper. I tried to make them neat and even, a small act of order in a place that felt increasingly off-kilter. It wasn't anything specific, just a weight in the air, a static charge that made the hairs on my arms prickle. I'd been doing this for 20 minutes, moving from booth to booth, and hadn't seen another soul. Not even a car pull into the parking lot. The chipped formica felt cool under my fingertips, a familiar discomfort. I'd scrubbed these tables enough times to know every stain, every imperfection. It was a pointless job, really. They'd be a mess again in a few hours, covered in syrup and coffee rings. But it was a task, and right now, tasks were good. Tasks were normal. Tasks meant I wasn't thinking about the old man, or the fly, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long in the corners of the room. I finished the last table near the restrooms and glanced at the clock. It was 3:17 a.m. I was supposed to take the trash out back in 15 minutes. The dumpster was nearly overflowing from the dinner rush, and the smell was already starting to seep into the air near the service entrance. That door always stuck too. You had to really lean into it. Put your weight against the metal frame to get it to budge. It wasn't ideal, especially when your hands were wet or full of garbage bags. I started walking toward the kitchen, intending to grab the heavy-duty trash bags. That's when I remembered the shortcut. The service entrance was right there, just past the dishwashing station. It would save me at least 2 minutes, maybe more. 2 minutes I could use to wipe down the grill or prep some bacon. 2 minutes I desperately needed before the breakfast crowd started trickling in. A little voice, a flicker of something I hadn't consciously registered, popped into my head. It wasn't a clear thought, more like a half-remembered phrase. Something about not going through that door alone. Something about being watched. It was tangled with the memory of the handbook, the strange rules. I couldn't place it, couldn't recall the exact wording, but the feeling was insistent, uncomfortable. I paused, one hand hovering over the swinging door to the kitchen. It was ridiculous, of course. Just an old building, a weird set of instructions from a previous employee who was probably just trying to scare the new hires. The service entrance was perfectly safe. I'd used it before plenty of times. But the thought lingered, a nagging discomfort that wouldn't dissipate. It was probably just the lack of sleep. I shook it off. It was just a door, a shortcut. I started walking toward the front of the restaurant instead. I walked around the counter, past the rows of empty booths, toward the main entrance. The automatic doors hissed open as I approached, letting in a rush of cool, damp air. It took 2 minutes, maybe a little more, to walk all the way around. By the time I reached the service entrance with the trash bags, the sky was starting to lighten, a faint gray glow on the horizon. I wrestled with the sticky door, finally getting it to swing open with a groan. The alleyway was deserted, quiet except for the distant hum of highway traffic. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that something was waiting on the other side of that door. Something that would have been waiting for me if I'd taken the shortcut. The image of the door itself kept replaying in my mind. The chipped paint, the rusted hinges, the small grime-covered window. It wasn't the image of a physical obstacle, but of an opening to something else. The smell of the dumpster hit me like a wall, acrid and overpowering. I started hauling the bags, trying to focus on the task at hand. But the weight of what I'd avoided, the unseen thing on the other side of that door, felt heavier than any garbage bag. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I worked, scanning the shadows, listening for a sound that never came, and I knew, with a sinking feeling, that the quiet wouldn't last, that whatever was back there wasn't finished. The smell of disinfectant was overwhelming. Gloria, on the day shift, must have really gone to town with the spray bottles. It coated everything, the tabletops, the booths, even the air vents. It wasn't a pleasant smell, but it was better than the lingering grease from the late-night rush. I was wiping down the salt and pepper shakers, meticulously polishing the chrome until it gleamed. It was quiet, eerily so. Usually, even at 5 a.m., you'd hear the trucks rumbling past on the highway or the occasional car pulling off the exit. But right now, it was just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rhythmic squeak of my cleaning cloth. I'd started a new playlist on my phone, old Woody Guthrie songs. It felt right, somehow, for a place like this. Dusty, worn, a little bit forgotten. I was humming along to "This Land Is Your Land" when I heard someone clear their throat. I turned around. A woman stood just inside the entrance holding a clipboard. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, a stark contrast to the faded vinyl booths and chipped formica countertops. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she had a pair of glasses perched on her nose. She looked official. "Good morning," she said, her voice crisp and efficient. "I'm with the county health department, just doing a routine inspection." I nodded, trying to appear calm. Inspections weren't uncommon, but they always made me nervous. Gloria handled most of them, but she wasn't scheduled to come in until 12 noon. "Just need a little information for our records," she continued, gesturing towards the clipboard. "Name, date of employment, standard stuff." She handed me a pen. I took it, glanced at the form, and started to write. "Gavin Bell." I paused, then added, "Bell." And that's when it hit me. The handbook, that ridiculous list of rules. I couldn't quite grasp which one, but it was there, lurking in the back of my mind. Something about last names, something about not giving more than was asked for. A fragmented, uneasy recollection. It was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. I'd been working too many late nights, not sleeping enough. I was letting that weird handbook get to me. It was a silly precaution, if it even existed at all. I'd misremembered it. But the feeling persisted. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck. A tightness in my chest. I looked up at the woman, her expression neutral, her eyes scanning the form. "Thank you," she said, taking the clipboard back. "And your employee number?" 428, I said automatically. I hadn't even thought about it. Just another piece of information. She scribbled it down. Then, she looked up again, her gaze lingering on my face for a moment longer than necessary. "Just making sure we have everything correct." She didn't say anything else, just continued to study the form. I busied myself with the salt and pepper shakers, trying to appear occupied. I polished them again and again, even though they were already spotless. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. After a few minutes, she closed the clipboard with a snap. "All right, that's everything. Thank you for your cooperation." She turned to leave, but paused at the door. She didn't look at me again. She looked past me, toward the kitchen, and for a fleeting moment, a shadow seemed to flicker across her face, a shadow that wasn't caused by the fluorescent lights. It was a distortion, a momentary ripple in her face that made it look like someone else was briefly superimposed over her features. She walked out, the automatic doors hissing shut behind her. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The feeling of unease hadn't gone away. It had intensified, settling into a cold knot in my stomach. I looked down at the salt and pepper shakers, the chrome gleaming under the harsh lights. They seemed wrong, out of place, like they didn't belong there. I slowly walked toward the kitchen, my steps hesitant. I needed to get back to work. I needed to focus on something, anything, to distract myself from the unsettling image of the woman's face. As I passed the booths, I glanced at the windows. The gray light of dawn was starting to fade, replaced by a dull, overcast sky. And I realized with a sudden, sickening certainty that the windows weren't reflecting the outside world. They were reflecting the inside. but altered, distorted. The booths weren't as they should be. They were slightly off-kilter, the colors muted, the shapes subtly wrong. It was like looking at a warped photograph, a fractured reflection of reality. I stopped, frozen. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. But the distortion remained. And as I stared at the warped reflection, I noticed something else. In the far corner of the diner, in the darkest part of the room, a figure stood motionless. A figure that hadn't been there a moment before. I couldn't make out any details. It was just a dark silhouette, a vague outline against the shadows. But it was there, watching. I turned away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had to get out of here. I had to get back to work, to pretend that everything was normal. But I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be normal again. I had given my last name, and something had noticed. I spent 20 minutes wiping down the counter, just pressing into the formica with the damp cloth. The overnight shift was always the worst for grime. People just didn't seem to care as much when nobody was watching, leaving sticky rings from their coffee cups, crumbs wedged into the seams. It was mindless work, which was good. I needed mindless work. I kept replaying the woman's face in my head, the way her eyes had fixed on me when I'd given her my last name. It wasn't the eyes themselves, not exactly. It was the stillness. Like she wasn't really seeing me, but seeing through me. Gloria was in the back, humming along to a country song on the radio. She'd been working here for 20 years, seen everything, and didn't much bother with small talk, which suited me fine. I finished the counter and started on the booths, pulling the vinyl cushions off and vacuuming underneath, the usual assortment of lost fries, sugar packets, and crumpled napkins. I was almost done when I remembered the stock. We were completely out of chocolate syrup. Mr. Henderson, the manager, would be upset if he found out. He was a stickler for the little things, especially when it came to breakfast. Pancakes without chocolate syrup were apparently a cardinal sin. The storage room was at the back, past the kitchen, through a heavy metal door that always stuck. It smelled like old cardboard and industrial cleaner. I hadn't been in there alone since I started remembering things, since the woman, and the feeling of being watched. I glanced toward the kitchen. Gloria was still humming, oblivious. I could ask her to come with me, but she was right in the middle of making a fresh pot of coffee, and I didn't want to bother her. It was just chocolate syrup. It wasn't like there were bears in the storage room. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door groaned in protest, scraping against the linoleum, and then I stepped inside. The cold hit me immediately. Not a draft, not the kind of chill you get from a poorly insulated building. This was different. It was absolute, a physical weight pressing against my skin. It stole the heat from my lungs with the first breath. I could see my breath, a small white cloud hanging in the air. In July. It wasn't noticeable at first. Just a slight coolness. But then it intensified, wrapping around me like a shroud. I looked around, expecting to see a broken freezer, a faulty air conditioning unit, but everything looked normal. Shelves stacked with cans and boxes, neatly arranged. The floor swept clean, no obvious source of the cold. I took another step, and another. The cold grew sharper, biting at my nostrils, numbing my fingertips. I could see my breath more clearly now, a constant visible reminder of the unnatural temperature. I stopped, halfway into the room, and felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made your teeth ache. It wasn't unpleasant. Exactly. Just wrong. Violating. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the refrigeration units were all running at full blast even though they shouldn't be. Maybe there was a leak in the coolant lines. Something explainable. Something practical. But I knew, even as I told myself this, that it wasn't true. The air felt empty. Like something had actively removed the warmth, like something was taking it. I remembered a fragment of the document I'd found tucked into that old cookbook, the one Mr. Henderson had insisted I read. Something about a cold spot. If a room felt noticeably colder than the adjacent rooms, don't go in alone. Something about needing another person, or leaving it for the next shift. The words weren't clear, fragmented and blurry in my memory. I glanced back toward the kitchen door. Gloria was still there, pouring coffee. I could call out to her, ask her to come with me. It would only take a minute. But the thought of turning my back on that cold, of stepping even further into the room alone, filled me with a sudden, overwhelming dread. I couldn't. I backed out of the doorway, slowly, carefully. Each step brought a small measure of relief as the temperature began to rise. I closed the metal door, the heavy clang echoing through the diner. Gloria didn't even look up. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, my chest tight. I needed that chocolate syrup. It was a busy weekend coming up. Without it, Mr. Henderson would be furious, but I couldn't go back in there. Not alone, not now. I turned and walked back toward the kitchen, feeling the weight of the undone task pressing down on me. I'd have to tell Mr. Henderson, explain why I couldn't get the stock. He wouldn't be happy, but it was better than whatever was in that room. I just hoped he didn't ask why I hadn't asked Gloria to go with me. I hadn't told anyone about the document, about the rules, and I wasn't about to start now. The breakfast rush would start soon. Someone would order chocolate pancakes, and I wouldn't have any syrup. It felt like a small thing, a stupid thing, but it was a consequence, all the same, and I knew with a chilling certainty that it wouldn't be the last. I was wiping down the formica, the red vinyl sticking to my forearm with a slight, unpleasant suction. 3:17 a.m., officially the deadest part of the dead zone. I'd already gone through the whole diner twice with the spray bottle and a rag. Tables, booths, counter, floor, even scrubbed the little salt and pepper shakers, just killing time, waiting for the clock to inch toward 6. The smell of industrial cleaner was thick in the air, battling it out with the lingering scent of stale coffee and frying grease. Not a pleasant combination, but it was familiar, comforting almost. I preferred it to the smell of nothing, that emptiness I'd felt near the storage room earlier. That was worse. At least the smell of bleach meant something was being cleaned. I was humming under my breath, an old Woody Guthrie song my dad used to play. This land is your land. I'd started scribbling lyrics in the margins of the pancake recipe book again. Small, messy handwriting crammed between instructions for buttermilk batter. It was a habit, something to do with my hands, something to distract me from thinking about the mortgage. Connie had called out sick, said her son Rand had a fever. I hadn't asked her details, didn't want to. Asking felt intrusive, like I was poking around in something that wasn't my business. I'd just covered her shift. Another 3 hours, another chunk out of the small amount of sleep I could afford. Mr. Henderson had left around midnight, muttering something about needing to get home to his wife. He was always polite, but distant, a little prickly. He'd given me a curt nod and a reminder about the chocolate syrup. Don't forget the syrup, Belle. We'll need it. The way he said my name always felt like a correction, a subtle reprimand. I finished wiping the counter and started stacking the clean sugar caddies. They were heavy, cold ceramic. I lined them up in neat rows, then rearranged them slightly just to have something to do. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the highway noise seemed muffled tonight. Then I noticed I was the only one left. I glanced toward the kitchen, expecting to see Gloria still there, maybe prepping the coffee for the morning, but the kitchen was dark, silent. I checked the clock again. 3:28 a.m. She'd left without saying anything, which wasn't entirely unusual. Gloria wasn't much of a talker, but she usually at least gave a little wave. A wave of mild irritation washed over me, just disappearing like that. Leaving me to finish up, it felt disrespectful, but then again, I wasn't exactly her supervisor. I was just the overnight cook, filling in, doing the best I could. I remembered something then. A half-formed thought dredged up from the same murky place as the cold spot warning. Something about closing up, about a procedure. It wasn't a formal rule, not like the others I'd read in that book. More like a suggestion or maybe an observation. Something about whoever was the last one leaving having to do something. The document. That old, brittle thing Mr. Henderson had insisted I read. I remembered a section about the end of the shift, something about making sure everything was right before leaving. A checklist, almost. I couldn't recall the specifics. Something about lights and rooms, saying the names of the rooms aloud, walking the perimeter. It sounded absurd, like a superstition. But the feeling that accompanied the memory wasn't dismissible. A low thrum of unease settled in my stomach. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, the late hours, and the looming bills. It was just my imagination running wild. I was probably just tired. That was all. I'd been working double shifts for a week. I needed sleep. I started the closing procedure anyway, just to be safe. It couldn't hurt. I flipped the open sign to closed, checked the cash register, counting the bills and coins, wiped down the coffee machine one last time. The list, or what I remembered of it, was vague. Something about checking every light switch. I went from booth to booth, flipping them off. Then the overhead lights. Each click echoed in the empty diner. Then I remembered the perimeter. Walking around the outside of the building. That seemed pointless, and frankly a little creepy. But the feeling, that low thrum of unease, had intensified. It was a tightening in my chest, a prickling at the back of my neck. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the front door. I walked around the building, shining my phone's flashlight along the brick exterior. The air was cold, crisp. The highway roared in the distance. I got to the back of the diner, near the service entrance, and that's when I realized I'd forgotten something. The rooms. I was supposed to say the names of the rooms aloud before leaving. The kitchen, the office, the storage room. I stood there, frozen, staring at the back door. It was ridiculous, a silly little thing, but the feeling, it was overwhelming now, a suffocating weight. I hesitated. It was just an old building, just a diner, just a superstition. I could skip it. No one would know. But I knew that wasn't true. I turned and went back inside, my flashlight beam dancing across the empty tables. I walked through the diner, reciting the names of the rooms in a low voice. Kitchen, office, storage room. The storage room. I paused. The coldness hadn't dissipated. It still radiated from behind that metal door. Saying the name felt wrong. I barely registered the act of opening the door, of quickly saying storage room before shutting it again. I just wanted to get it over with. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to go home. I locked the front door, double-checked the bolts, and then I walked to my car, the keys cold in my hand. I didn't realize, until I was halfway home, driving down the dark highway, that I hadn't said the name of the break room. I hadn't said break room, and I hadn't thought about it, even once while I was walking the perimeter. It wasn't on my mind at all. The thought settled over me, cold and heavy, like a stone in my gut. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. Something was different. Something was wrong. And I had a feeling, a terrible, creeping feeling, that I'd just made a mistake. A big one. The smell of burnt sugar hung in the air, even after I'd scraped the remnants of the last pancake batter from the griddle. It was a stubborn smell, clinging to everything. I was wiping down the stainless steel, methodically moving from left to right to left, trying to get the sticky film off. 3 a.m., the worst part of the shift, not busy, not quiet, just suspended, like being underwater. I'd started listening to old country again. Loretta Lynn on the tiny, crackling radio. It filled the space but didn't really reach it. I'd been scribbling lyrics in the margins of the breakfast specials flyer. Coal miner's daughter this time. Felt appropriate, I guess. Dad worked in the mines for a while, before the black lung started. The medical bills were always there, a dull ache behind everything. Connie was supposed to come in at 5. She usually brought a thermos of that awful hazelnut coffee. I hated hazelnut coffee, but it was better than nothing. At least it was warm. I checked the clock again. 3:17. Still a long stretch. I finished the griddle, then moved onto the counter, wiping up stray crumbs and dried syrup. The fluorescent lights hummed, a high-pitched whine that seemed to burrow into my skull. I was stacking the clean plates, making a precarious tower when Rand walked out of the office. He'd been doing inventory for the past hour, mostly just staring at a spreadsheet on his laptop. Rand was quiet. He kept to himself. He didn't make eye contact. He hadn't said 2 words to me all night. He was buttoning his jacket, pulling on a baseball cap. He looked tired. "All right, Gavin," he said, his voice raspy. "See you tomorrow." The words hit me wrong, like a physical jolt. I froze, a plate halfway to the stack. "See you tomorrow." That wasn't right. The feeling was instant, visceral. A tightness in my chest, a prickling on the back of my neck. It wasn't a logical thing, just wrong. I'd been thinking about the ritual all night, the perimeter walk, the naming of the rooms, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, flickered at the edge of my awareness. Something about how you left. I tried to dismiss it. Rand was just being polite. He always said goodbye. It was a normal thing to say. I was exhausted. I hadn't slept properly in days. The stress of the bills, the weight of the house, everything was getting to me. I was probably just being paranoid. But my hand wouldn't move. The plate felt heavy, slick with soap. Rand was already at the door, his hand on the handle. He glanced back at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, a sound. A low, rhythmic thumping coming from the kitchen. Not loud, but persistent, like a badly tuned engine. It wasn't a machine I recognized. It didn't sound like any of the diner's equipment. The noise pulled my attention away from Rand, from the door, from the unnerving way he was looking at me. I swallowed hard. Hold on a sec, Rand," I said and placed the plate on the counter with a clatter. I walked towards the kitchen, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. The thumping grew louder as I approached the walk-in freezer. It was coming from inside the freezer. I stopped just short of the door, then turned back to Rand. He was still standing there, his hand still on the handle, but now he was smiling. A small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Without thinking, I said, "Have a good night." The words felt hollow, wrong, but they were out there, hanging in the air. Rand nodded, a barely perceptible movement, and then he was gone. The door swung shut behind him with a soft click. The thumping from the freezer stopped. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence. The burnt sugar smell seemed stronger now, almost cloying. I hadn't said what I was supposed to say. I hadn't used the phrase. Whatever the phrase was, I couldn't even remember what it was supposed to be. Only the feeling that I'd broken something again. I turned back to the kitchen, and the cold that radiated from the walk-in freezer felt different now. Not just cold, but expectant. Like it was waiting for something. I didn't go near the freezer. I didn't need to. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that tonight wasn't going to be like any other night. The grill was quiet for a stretch. 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The highway was mostly empty. An occasional 18-wheeler rumbled past, shaking the chipped formica of the counter. I was wiping down the stainless steel, going over the same spots again and again, just to have something to do. The smell of stale coffee and bacon grease was thick in the air, even after I'd run the exhaust fan for a while. It clings to everything in here. I'd started a new habit, scribbling lyrics in the margins of the order pad. Old Woody Guthrie stuff. "This land was made for you and me," I wrote, then crossed it out. Felt wrong somehow. Too optimistic for a place like this. I flipped to a clean page and started on Pastures of Plenty, but couldn't get past the first line. My mind kept drifting. Connie was supposed to come in at 5 to relieve me. I was already dreading handing over the graveyard shift. Not because of her. Connie was all right. Just this place. It felt heavier each night, more watchful. I moved on to restocking the sugar caddies, methodically filling each one. That's when I found it. A manila folder tucked behind a stack of paper placemats. It wasn't labeled, which was unusual. Everything in this place had a label, a number, a system, even the salt shakers. I pulled it out, flipped it open. It was an incident report, a faded, yellowed thing. The date at the top caught my eye, July 14th, 1998. A long time ago. I skimmed the first page. Something about a missing person, a cook, a night shift cook, like me. The report was filled with bureaucratic language, statements from other employees, a brief description of the events. It mentioned a discrepancy in the inventory, a malfunctioning freezer, and a disturbance. A general sense of unease reported by several staff members. Nothing concrete. Just a lot of vague descriptions and unanswered questions. Then I saw a handwritten note at the bottom of the page, scrawled in a shaky hand. It said, "File sealed. Do not reopen." I frowned. That felt wrong. It wasn't a direct instruction, not like the things I'd remembered from the document, more of a warning, a strong suggestion. Still, it stirred something uneasy inside me, the feeling that I'd already messed things up enough that I was poking around where I shouldn't be. It was just an old incident report, probably some disgruntled employee who walked off the job. A simple case of a missing person, closed and forgotten. I'd been letting this place get to me. The silence, the darkness, the endless loop of cooking eggs and pouring coffee, it was making me paranoid. That's all. I started to reach for the file number, to see if I could find any more information, any closure. But then a flicker of something cold ran across the back of my neck. A chill that had nothing to do with the diner's ventilation, and I remembered, not a specific sentence, but the feeling of the document, the way it had stressed certain things. Things best left alone. Things that once disturbed couldn't be put back. A sense that some doors were meant to stay closed. My hand froze, hovering over the file. I didn't bother looking for the number. I didn't need to. I knew instinctively that finding it wouldn't bring answers. It would only bring trouble. Slowly, I closed the folder and tucked it back behind the placemats. Pushed it further back so it was hidden from view. I didn't want to see it again. Didn't want to even know what was inside. The whole thing felt tainted, like looking at it had somehow dirtied me. I finished restocking the sugar, then went back to wiping down the counter. My movements were jerky, mechanical. I kept glancing at the stack of placemats, at the spot where the folder was hidden. Everything felt colder now, not just the diner but inside me. A coldness that settled in my chest and spread outwards, numbing my limbs. I could taste something metallic at the back of my throat. Not like blood, but like old pennies. I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. Still a long time until Connie arrived. I needed to focus, needed to keep busy, but the image of that yellowed file, the date, the handwritten warning was burned into my mind. I noticed for the first time the way the fluorescent lights flickered. Not a dramatic strobe, just a subtle, almost imperceptible pulse. It was always there, I realized. I just hadn't noticed it before. I hadn't been looking for it. And now, I couldn't stop looking. I was wiping down the vinyl booths, starting with the ones closest to the windows. It was a pointless task, really. They'd be covered in crumbs and spilled syrup again within the hour. But it was something to do. Something to occupy my hands and my mind. The early morning light was starting to bleed through the blinds, painting stripes across the empty tables. It made the chipped formica look almost pleasant. The radio was playing some old country song, a mournful tune about lost love and bad decisions. Fitting, I thought. I'd been humming along, mostly to drown out the flickering of the lights. It was still there, that subtle pulse. I hadn't gotten used to it. I doubted I ever would. I moved onto the booth by the front door, the one with the ripped seat cushion. I'd asked Connie about getting it replaced, but she just waved her hand and said they were waiting on a bulk order. Everything was always on order. It was a good way to avoid spending money. That's when I noticed it. My coffee cup, bright yellow. A souvenir from some roadside attraction we'd stopped at on our anniversary a few years back. I'd brought it with me this morning, a small comfort in a place that felt increasingly uncomfortable. And something about the yellow against the faded red of the booth felt wrong. Not visually wrong, exactly. More like a disruption, a jarring note, a sudden silent alarm. It wasn't a conscious thought, not at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck. A sense of unease that settled in my stomach. I tried to dismiss it. It was just a coffee cup. A stupid, cheerful yellow coffee cup. I'd been overthinking things since finding that file. since Rand leaving with that strange little nod, since everything really. It was probably just the light. The way the yellow reflected and distorted the shapes around it. I took a sip, the coffee lukewarm and bitter. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Then a fragment of something surfaced. Not a clear memory, but a sensation. The feeling of reading that document, the one hidden behind the placemats. A warning. Something about not bringing certain things inside. Something about colors. I couldn't grasp the specifics. I hadn't even bothered to really read the thing. Just skimmed it, convinced it was some ancient, irrelevant company policy. But now, the gist of it was enough. Something about avoiding attention, about not making things noticeable. It was ridiculous, of course. A coffee cup? Really? I was letting my imagination run wild. I was stressed about the bills, about the house, about everything, and now I was attributing sinister significance to a piece of ceramic. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had inadvertently stepped into something I didn't understand, that I had violated some unseen boundary. And this time, it wasn't about a careless word or a missed step, it was about something tangible, something I could hold in my hand. Without thinking, I stood up and walked over to my backpack, which I'd left by the dishwashing station. I carefully placed the coffee cup inside, zipping it up tight. I didn't want anyone to see it, didn't want to draw any attention to myself. As I turned back to the booths, I saw it, or rather, I thought I saw it, a flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision, a shadow that wasn't quite a shadow. It was near the back, by the storage room door. I blinked, thinking it was just fatigue. I hadn't slept well in days, but when I opened my eyes, it was still there. A subtle distortion in the air, a wavering of the light, like looking through heat haze. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. It wasn't a person, not an animal. It was more like a space, an empty space that shouldn't have been there, a gap in reality. It lasted only a few seconds. Then it was gone, vanished into the dimness of the diner, leaving only the flickering lights and the mournful country song. I stood there for a long time, heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I wanted to rationalize it, to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But I couldn't. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been, and it had felt aware. I glanced at my backpack, at the yellow coffee cup hidden inside. I felt a surge of nausea. It wasn't about the cup itself. It was about what it represented, about the fact that I had brought something into this place that didn't belong. I finished wiping down the booths, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I avoided looking towards the back of the diner. I checked my watch, 4:32 a.m., still hours until Connie arrived. I started making a fresh pot of coffee using one of the diner's plain white mugs. I realized I hadn't taken a single sip of the coffee I'd brought. It was still sitting in the yellow cup hidden in my bag. I couldn't get rid of it. Not yet. I didn't want to risk drawing attention. I didn't know what would happen if I did, but I knew with a chilling certainty that it had to leave with me. I kept glancing towards the storage room. It loomed at the end of the hallway, a dark and silent rectangle. The cold spot. I avoided it like the plague, sticking to the front of the diner, focusing on the mundane tasks. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a fly caught in a spider web. I knew deep down that the night was far from over, and that whatever had been lurking in the shadows was still out there, waiting. I was restocking the sugar caddies. It was just past 5, and the diner was empty, like it always was at this hour. I liked this part of the shift before the truckers started rolling in. Just me and the hiss of the coffee machine and the low hum of the fluorescent lights. It was peaceful. I'd gotten into a rhythm, filling each caddy, wiping down the plastic with a damp cloth. I'd been trying to remember the lyrics to House of the Rising Sun, but kept getting stuck on the third verse. My dad used to sing that song. He'd play it on his old guitar, a battered Gibson that now sat in the corner of my living room, collecting dust. I should probably learn to play it myself. Maybe then I wouldn't keep messing up the words. I finished with the sugar and moved on to the salt shakers. That's when I noticed it. The shelf, the big industrial shelf that held all the extra stock, the canned vegetables, the boxes of pancake mix, the industrial-sized ketchup bottles. It wasn't where I remembered leaving it. It was only a few inches, maybe 6, but it had been moved, pulled away from the wall. And not just pulled, but turned. It now faced slightly towards the middle of the diner, instead of straight against the wall. It was a heavy thing, that shelf, on wheels, yes, but still, it would take some effort to move it. Rand hadn't mentioned anything about moving stock. Connie hadn't either, and I definitely hadn't done it. I frowned, rubbing my chin. Probably just Rand, being Rand. He was always fiddling with things, trying to improve the flow of the kitchen. He didn't really understand what flow meant, though. It was usually more disruptive than helpful. He'd probably decided it would be easier to grab cans from the middle, even though it made no sense. It was a stupid idea. I wanted to push it back. I needed to push it back. The way it was now, it blocked access to the fire extinguisher. A small thing maybe, but a vital one. I reached out my hand, hovering over the cool metal of the frame. I could get it done quickly. No one would even notice. Then I remembered something. A fragment of something I'd read, buried in that ridiculous document the previous manager had left in the office. Something about furniture, about not interfering. If something was moved, you were supposed to log it and leave it. It seemed absurd. Utterly, completely absurd. But the feeling, that cold knot in my stomach, that tightening in my chest, it was the same feeling I'd gotten when I'd used the wrong phrase with Rand, the same feeling when I'd peeked at that incident report. Like I was violating something fundamental, something I didn't understand, but knew I couldn't ignore. I pulled my notebook from my apron pocket and scribbled a quick note. Stock shelf moved approximately 6 inches from wall, facing inwards, noted 5:17 a.m. I dated it. Even though there was no real system for logging these things, it felt necessary. Like acknowledging the change was the only way to appease whatever was causing that prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I needed to check the expiration dates on the canned peaches. They were on the top shelf, the one now partially obscured by the repositioned stock rack. I stretched, reaching around the side, but couldn't quite get to them. It would have been a simple reach before. Now I'd have to climb onto a chair. I glanced around, then deliberately didn't climb onto the chair. It wasn't worth it. Not worth risking whatever it was I was risking. I made a mental note to ask Connie about the peaches later. She was taller than me. She could reach them easily. I kept working, restocking the napkin dispensers, wiping down the counter, but my mind kept returning to the shelf. It felt wrong, like a discordant note in an otherwise ordered space. And the fire extinguisher. I kept glancing at it, half hidden behind the metal frame. I finished the napkin dispensers and started on the coffee filters. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. That leaving the shelf like that was inviting something. But the rule, that stupid, illogical rule, was clear. Don't move it. Almost 6 o'clock. The sky was beginning to lighten, a pale gray glow creeping over the horizon. I glanced out the window, then back at the shelf. I noticed something else now, something I hadn't seen before. The floor. There were no wheel marks, none. Even though the shelf was heavy and the floor was smooth linoleum, there should have been some indication that it had been rolled. But there wasn't. It was as if it had been lifted. I shivered, despite the warmth of the diner. I went back to the coffee filters, my hands moving mechanically. I kept thinking about those peaches. They were due to expire next week. If I didn't check them, Connie would have to. And Connie had a terrible cold coming on. She'd been coughing all last night. I could hear it, even over the hum of the refrigerator. A wet, rattling cough. The thought of her getting sick, of having to deal with the extra work, settled heavy in my chest. I should have just moved the shelf. It would have taken 2 seconds, but I didn't. Because of a rule. A rule I didn't understand. A rule that felt dangerous. And now Connie was going to be exposed to potentially expired peaches, and I had no way to warn her. The fluorescent lights of the Denny's flickered as I clocked out. 6 a.m., officially done. Rand was already gone, sweeping the front patio. A rhythmic scrape of the broom against the concrete. I didn't say anything. I didn't even look at him. The words felt stuck. I'd practiced until tomorrow a dozen times in my head on the drive in, but it wouldn't come out. It felt like forcing a piece of gravel across my tongue. I just nodded and walked past him, out into the pre-dawn chill. The air smelled different outside. Sharper, less saturated. Inside, everything smelled like stale coffee and grease. A smell I'd grown to associate with safety somehow. Here, it was just cold. I fumbled with my keys, unlocking the truck. The metal felt colder than usual, almost biting. I glanced back at the diner. Rand was still sweeping, head down. He hadn't looked up. I drove home slowly, trying to shake off the weight of the night. It hadn't been particularly busy, but every moment had felt stretched and brittle. I kept expecting something to shift, like a radio frequency drifting out of tune. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion. The stress with the house, Dad's bills. The constant low-humming panic about losing everything. It had to be that. I made coffee as soon as I got in, black and strong. I needed something to reset my system. I almost reached for my yellow mug. The one Nell had given me for my birthday, then stopped. Just stopped. My hand hovered over it for a beat, then dropped to the chipped ceramic one with the faded blue flowers. It felt strangely deliberate, like correcting a mistake I hadn't even consciously made. I didn't know why. I just knew I couldn't use the yellow one. Not anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping the coffee, staring out at the backyard. The leaves were starting to turn, a muted orange and brown. Dad had always taken pride in his garden. I hadn't touched it since he died. I didn't have the energy. I was supposed to mow the lawn that day. I made a note on a pad, then another, scribbling out the first one. It was too early. The grass was still damp. I needed to let it dry. It was just practical. I went upstairs to shower. The bathroom was small and cramped. I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, more guarded. My eyes seemed smaller, like I was squinting even when I wasn't. I ran a hand over my jaw, feeling the stubble. I hadn't shaved properly in days. I didn't feel like making the effort. After the shower, I grabbed a clean shirt and went back downstairs. I noticed something on the kitchen counter. A flyer. It was a brightly colored advertisement for a job opening. Overnight cook, Denny's, with a photograph of the diner looking deceptively cheerful in the morning light. I stared at the flyer for a long time. I didn't understand why it was there. I hadn't put it there. My wife, Gloria, must have. She was always looking for ways to help with the bills. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash. I couldn't. I just couldn't go back. Later that week, I drove past the Denny's on my way to the hardware store. It was a gray, overcast day. The parking lot was full. I glanced over and saw someone unloading boxes from a delivery truck. A young guy, wearing a clean white uniform. He was carrying a box labeled napkins. As he straightened up, he paused, looking toward the back of the diner. For a moment, I thought he was looking right at me. He then turned and walked toward the service entrance. A small, almost imperceptible hesitation in his step. He didn't look back.